It was past midnight when a stranger's car died in Mara's driveway. She wanted nothing to do with him, so she told the towering man with the strange golden eyes to call a tow truck. He refused. She charged him triple just to make him leave. He paid without arguing. Mara thought fixing his car would be the end of it. Then she looked up and found the stranger staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. She frowned. "What?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. "After all these years." Mara tightened her grip on the wrench. "Do I know you?" He took one slow step closer. "No," he said. "You're my lost mate." Mara stared at him. What exactly is a mate? Chapter 1. The wrench slipped, biting hard and fast into her knuckles. Mara sucked the warm blood from her scraped skin, tasting the sharp, dirty tang of iron. She was 24, completely alone in the world, and fiercely happy about it because quiet meant safety. She liked her grease-stained life. She liked fixing old, broken carburetors. Have you ever felt perfectly safe, right before the floor falls out from under you? That safety shattered the moment the massive, roaring engine of a vintage black car died in her driveway. It was past midnight. The analog clock on the brick wall ticked like a warning. Steady, hollow, and far too loud. Outside, a man stepped out of the dead vehicle. Mara wiped her oil-slicked hands on her denim overalls. She grabbed a solid crowbar from the bench. She knew engines. She knew metal. She did not know the dark, towering danger currently standing in her driveway. He was huge. Over 6.5 feet of pure, intimidating muscle wrapped in a dark winter coat. His eyes caught the dim yellow porch light, but they weren't just reflecting it. They were glowing. A piercing, unnatural gold. A thick scent rolled off him, immediately flooding the garage. It smelled like wild pine, cracked thunderstorms, and absolute control. Mara's chest tightened. A strange phantom ache flared violently in her right shoulder. It was a crescent-shaped scar she had carried since childhood, a jagged mark that only ever burned when the moon was completely full. Why did it suddenly feel like it was on fire now? Moving forward because she refused to let any man intimidate her on her own property, Mara gripped the cold iron tightly. "Shop's closed," she called out. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stranger didn't move. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He just watched her. His golden eyes locked onto her face, and his chest stopped moving entirely. It was as if he had forgotten how to breathe. His large hand tightened around the edge of his open car door. He stared at her like a man trying to convince himself that a ghost was real. Because of his terrifying silence, Mara remembered a story her adoptive father used to tell. He talked about a wild, starving wolf he once saw in the frozen woods. The beast didn't attack right away. It just froze, staring at its prize, overwhelmed by the sudden, shocking end of a very long hunt. That was exactly how this man was looking at her. Like he was starving. Like she was the only thing keeping him alive. She hated his stare because it made her feel completely exposed and utterly vulnerable. "I said I'm closed," Mara snapped. She stepped fully into the harsh yellow light. "Call a tow truck." "I don't need a truck," his voice rumbled. It was deep, rough. It vibrated in the damp night air and sent a strange, electric shiver straight down Mara's spine. "I need you to fix it." In stark contrast to the freezing wind, a hot flush crept up Mara's neck. She looked at the vintage engine block. It was an old-school mechanical beast. No computers. Just raw, honest parts. She could fix it in her sleep, but she desperately wanted this terrifying, golden-eyed man gone. "It will cost you triple," she lied, raising her chin. She charged him triple because she wanted him to leave immediately, hoping the ridiculous price would drive him away. The giant of a man simply pulled a thick wad of cash from his coat and tossed it onto the hood. "Fix it." Mara stared at the money. She stared at him. She didn't know it yet, but opening that rusted hood was the very last normal thing she would ever do. Mara leaned over the grill of the car, her hands moving expertly over the cold, oily metal. She replaced a cracked fuel line. She tightened a loose alternator belt. She wiped away years of built-up grime. Once, she rebuilt a ruined engine from scratch, using nothing but scrap parts and sheer, unyielding stubbornness. She knew exactly how to force broken things to work, but she didn't know how to handle the man standing directly behind her. He was too close. The immense heat radiating off his body was impossible for a normal human. "You're staring," Mara muttered. She didn't look up from the engine block. "I have looked for you for 19 years, he said. The wrench slipped from her hand. It clattered loudly against the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Following that incredibly intense statement, Mara slowly turned around. She wiped her greasy hands on a rag, trying desperately to keep her breathing steady. "Buddy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I've never seen you before in my life." The man stepped closer. He moved with a strange, liquid grace, too smooth, too silent for a man his size. "My name is Darian Veyer." His voice faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing a tiny, devastating crack in his iron control. "I am the Alpha King of the Wolf Kingdoms, and you are my mate." Mara stared at him. Then, she let out a loud, harsh laugh. "Right," she scoffed. "Alpha King, Wolf Kingdoms. Did you hit your head when the car broke down?" Darian didn't smile. He didn't blink. He reached out slowly. His large, calloused fingers gently brushed a smudge of black grease from her cheek. The touch sent a violent electric shock straight through her bones. Mara gasped and slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me." Why would a man who looked like he owned the world look at her with such agonizing reverence? It terrified her. "You are my mate," Darian whispered. His voice was laced with something dark and heavily restrained. "I belong to myself," Mara shouted. She grabbed her fallen wrench and pointed it directly at his broad chest. "I fix broken things. I hide in quiet places. I survive by staying invisible. I don't belong to any kingdom, and I sure as hell don't belong to some arrogant stranger who plays make-believe in my driveway." She expected him to get angry. She expected him to shout back or assert his dominance. Instead, Darian's glowing eyes softened. A tragic, heavy sorrow washed over his sharp features. He took a deliberate step back, raising his hands in quiet surrender. "What that means is your choice," Darian said softly. He was offering her space. He was offering her control. In the wake of his sudden retreat, a strange, undeniable ache pulled violently at Mara's chest. She actually wanted to step toward him. The urge was raw, unnatural. Deep in her mind, she suddenly thought of the locked iron box her father had made her promise to bury in the woods without ever opening. He told her the past was dangerous. Was this the danger he meant? "Car's fixed," she whispered, her voice shaking badly. "Take your keys." "Leave." Darian nodded slowly. He picked up the silver keys from the bench. "I will not force you, Mara, but I will not disappear." He turned to open his car door. She thought the strange, terrifying night was finally over, but the deep shadows at the edge of the woods were hiding something else entirely. The garage was entirely silent, yet Mara suddenly felt something pressing heavily against her ears. Darian had his hand on the door handle. He was leaving, but Mara couldn't look at him anymore, because her attention was violently hijacked by the dark, swaying tree line. Her heartbeat accelerated, until it seemed to hammer against every bone in her chest. Then, another sound layered over it. It was a second heartbeat. Not hers. It was coming from the woods, 50 yards away. How could she possibly hear a heartbeat from 50 yards away? "Do you hear that?" Mara gasped. She grabbed her chest. The crescent scar on her shoulder ignited. It didn't just burn. It seared like white-hot iron melting directly into her flesh. Darian froze. The softness disappeared from his face. Not anger, not panic. Something colder. Something that made Mara understand, for the very first time, exactly what kind of man had been standing in her garage. The air pressure in the garage dropped completely. Something massive shifted in the shadows. It was fast, impossibly fast. A blur of dark, matted fur and glowing, sickly yellow eyes launched from the tree line. It was headed straight for Mara's exposed back. She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to scream. Instinct, ancient, buried, and terrifying, took over. Before the shadowy creature could clear the concrete driveway, Mara's legs moved. She twisted her body with a violent, impossible agility. She leaped backward, clearing the entire hood of the vintage car in a single, fluid bound. Her landing was completely silent, perfect balance, zero impact. No human could move like that. The beast crashed into the metal tool bench where Mara had just been standing. Wrenches, ratchets, and glass jars shattered violently across the concrete floor. Before the beast could recover, Darian was there. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't transform. Darian simply released a growl so deep, it literally shook the dust from the wooden rafters. His eyes flared like miniature suns. He grabbed the thrashing intruder by its furry throat, with one bare, human hand. He slammed the creature into the brick wall, cracking the solid mortar with frightening ease. "Leave," Darian commanded. The creature choked, its yellow eyes wide with absolute terror. It stumbled backward, suddenly desperate to escape, and vanished into the trees. As a direct result of the sudden quiet, silence crashed back into the ruined garage. Darian didn't chase it. He turned his head slowly. His chest was heaving, and his golden eyes locked intensely on Tamara. She was crouched on the other side of the vintage car. Her chest was heaving wildly. Her fingernails had inexplicably carved deep, ragged grooves into the hard steel of the car's hood. She stared at the scratch marks, trembling violently. "What?" Mara choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "What was that?" Darian took a slow, measured step toward her. "A wolf." Mara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You mean, an actual wolf?" Darian looked down at the deep claw marks she had effortlessly ripped into the metal. "Not the kind you're thinking of." Because her senses were screaming, the absolute impossibility of the situation became undeniable. Darian looked back up at her. He didn't look at the metal anymore. He looked at the way she was crouching. Perfectly balanced, muscles coiled tight, ready to spring again. "Your mother used to move like that," Darian said quietly. Mara froze completely. The air vanished from her lungs. She had never told this stranger anything about her family. She didn't even know her mother. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was a mechanic. She fixed broken things. But as the wild, terrifying energy raced furiously through her veins, she realized her human life wasn't broken. It was a lie. Following that impossible revelation, Mara's hands began to shake violently. "My mother?" she whispered. The winter wind howled through the open garage doors. The familiar scent of spilled motor oil suddenly mixed with the heavy, wild pine, radiating from Darian. "How do you know about my mother?" Mara demanded. Her voice cracked. She stepped toward him, because she needed actual answers, not riddles. For 24 years, her adoptive father had told her that her mother died in a normal, tragic car crash. But Darian was looking at her like he knew the deepest, oldest secrets of her blood. Darian did not step forward to crowd her. He stayed perfectly still, clearly understanding the fragile line she was walking. "I knew her briefly," Darian answered softly. His golden eyes were steady and carefully guarded. "Before the night you disappeared, she was fierce, just like you." Despite the freezing air, Mara felt a sudden, boiling heat in her chest. She turned away from him. She couldn't look at his intense, golden stare anymore. She stared out into the dark, swaying trees where the impossible wolf had just fled. Her father's warning suddenly echoed in her mind, loud and frantic. "Have you ever tried to fix a shattered car windshield? You can glue the pieces back together, but the glass is never perfectly clear again. The cracks always show." Mara's entire reality was cracking right down the middle, and she refused to simply stand there and watch it break. She needed proof. "Wait here," Mara ordered. She grabbed a rusted iron shovel from the corner of the garage. She marched straight out into the freezing night, heading for the edge of the woods. She walked past the deep claw marks she had left on her own driveway. What would you do if everything you knew about yourself was buried in the cold dirt? Mara marched to the base of an ancient, twisted oak tree. She remembered a stormy night many years ago. She remembered her father standing in the pouring rain, digging a deep hole while she watched from the bedroom window. He told her he was burying dangerous memories. He made her promise to never, ever dig them up. But she was breaking that promise tonight, because the life she understood was beginning to unravel. She drove the shovel into the frozen earth. She dug with frantic, unnatural strength. Her muscles didn't ache. Her breathing didn't labor. She moved heavy, frozen dirt faster than any human possibly could. Darian stood at the edge of the porch light, simply watching her with quiet respect. He let her work. He let her find the truth herself. The blade of the shovel struck something solid. Clang. As a direct result of the heavy impact, the metal shovel vibrated painfully in Mara's hands. She dropped the wooden handle. She dropped to her knees in the damp, freezing dirt. Her grease-stained fingers frantically clawed at the loose, dark soil until she fully uncovered it. It was a heavy iron box, rusted, padlocked. She didn't go back for a key. She didn't grab her heavy bolt cutters. Instead, that strange, primal instinct took over her hands again. She gripped the thick steel padlock. She squeezed. Her bones popped. The muscles in her arms bunched tightly together. With a sharp, sickening snap, the thick metal lock shattered into pieces. Mara stared at her own trembling hands. What am I? She thought. Right after the broken lock hit the dirt, the air around her grew incredibly heavy. She lifted the creaky, rusted lid. The smell of old, dried lavender drifted up, preserving the secrets inside. Wrapped in a faded cloth were only 2 items. The first was a tiny, primitive leather tunic, small enough for a toddler. It was entirely handmade, stitched with animal sinew. No modern tags. No human factory made this. The second item made her heart stop entirely. It was a heavy silver pendant. It was shaped like a roaring wolf head, encircled by a crescent moon. It matched the exact shape of the burning scar on her right shoulder. A large, warm shadow fell over her. Darian knelt beside her in the dirt. He didn't care about ruining his expensive coat. He looked down into the iron box, his golden eyes locking instantly onto the heavy silver pendant. You know this, Mara breathed out, her pulse racing. Yes, Darian said. His voice was dangerously quiet. What is it? Darian hesitated. The muscle in his jaw flexed as he stared at the wolf head. A symbol from my kingdom. Mara looked from the cold silver to his glowing eyes. Whose? Darian's eyes remained on the pendant. That is what I don't understand. How did your father come to possess it? Stepping back into her garage, Mara felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest. She stood in the center of the concrete floor. Tools were scattered everywhere. The tool bench was severely dented. Glass jars of bolts were shattered across the ground. But the brick walls were still standing. The roof was still intact. She could fix it. She always fixed broken things. But right now, she couldn't fix the gaping hole in her own memory. Darian stood near the open door of his vintage car. He watched her survey the damage. There are things about your past that I cannot explain here, Darian stated plainly. His voice was calm, offering no pressure. Mara turned to face him. Then where can you? In my kingdom, Darian answered. Across the border, where the modern world ends. He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch between them. But you do not have to come tonight. The choice is entirely yours. He didn't order her. He didn't tell her she would die without his protection. He simply offered her the door and stepped back to let her decide if she wanted to walk through it. She looked at her damaged, beloved garage. She looked at the heavy silver pendant in her hand. She looked at the incredibly powerful, restrained man waiting patiently by the car. If she stayed, she would remain in the dark forever. Mara walked over to her dented workbench. She didn't pack clothes. She didn't pack photos. She packed cold, hard steel. She rolled up her favorite wrenches, a heavy hammer, and a pair of pliers into a thick canvas tool roll. She tied it tight. She wasn't going to leave the life she had built behind. She was bringing it with her into his primal world. Mara walked past Darian. She walked straight to the passenger door of his vintage car and pulled it open herself. I'm not going because you're my mate, Mara said sharply, looking at him over the dark roof of the car. I'm going because I refuse to be helpless, and because I want the whole truth. A slow, breathtaking look of profound respect settled over Darian's sharp features. He didn't push. He didn't boast. Then we'll find the truth, Darian rumbled. He slid into the driver's seat. The powerful engine roared to life under Mara's expert tuning. As the heavy car rolled out of the driveway, the warm yellow porch light remained on behind them, waiting for the day she would finally return to fix what was left behind. The smooth asphalt road didn't just end. It vanished, swallowed entirely by an ancient, suffocating forest that smelled sharply of cold earth and crushed pine. Mara gripped the leather door handle tightly as Darian killed the vintage car's engine. They had driven for hours, leaving the neon glow of the human cities far behind. Now, there were no streetlights, no power lines. There was only the towering, impossible darkness of the Wolf Kingdoms. We walk from here, Darian said quietly. His golden eyes scanned the deep timberline. Machines do not cross this border. Because his solemn tone carried a heavy finality, Mara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She stepped out of the car, clutching her canvas tool roll against her chest like a makeshift shield. The air here was entirely different. It was heavy, it was primal. She remembered a time when she was 12, getting completely lost in a sprawling, rusted junkyard. She had felt so tiny then, surrounded by mountains of jagged metal. She felt that exact same terrifying smallness now, standing at the edge of this untamed territory. Moving forward into the thick trees, Mara followed Darian's broad shoulders. They walked past towering stone markers carved with crescent moons. As the trees cleared, a massive settlement opened up before them, built purely of rough-hewn stone and thick timber logs. Firelight flickered from iron braziers, casting long, dancing shadows across the packed dirt paths. As they entered the main courtyard, the entire camp seemed to pause. Mara paid close attention to the way the people reacted. A young woman carrying a woven basket stopped and stared at Mara in pure, wide-eyed fascination. Two older men near a roasting fire scowled softly, whispering to each other. But everyone, without exception, stepped completely out of Darian's path. She noticed the way the warriors stepped back. She noticed the way the elders lowered their eyes. She noticed the absolute silence that followed his steps. He didn't have to demand their respect, because he commanded it simply by existing in the space. There were no guards shouting orders. There was just Darian, moving through his people with a quiet, unquestioned authority. A large gray wolf watched her from a high stone ridge, its intelligent eyes tracking her every movement before it melted silently into the shadows. Why did that specific wolf look at her with such strange familiarity? And who had given her father that silver pendant all those years ago? "Keep close," Darian murmured, pulling her from her thoughts. "I'm fine," Mara lied, though she stayed near his side. He didn't offer a protective arm, understanding she would reject it. Instead, he simply guided her through the sea of curious faces, leading her toward a massive stone hearth at the center of the camp. The heat radiating from the flames was intense, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming reality of the world she had just walked into. In stark contrast to the quiet tension of the night before, the morning sun brought a heavy, rhythmic thudding to the kingdom's training grounds. Mara sat on a smooth stone bench, drinking something hot and herbal from a wooden mug. She was watching Darian spar. There were no training weapons. No padded gear. It was just brutal, hand-to-hand combat, testing speed and muscle before a shift. Darian moved like dark water. He was massive, yet incredibly precise. He dodged a heavy swing, grabbed his opponent's wrist, and twisted just enough to disarm the man without breaking the bone. He possessed terrifying strength, yet he exercised total, absolute restraint. Mara caught herself leaning forward, her eyes tracing the steady, controlled rhythm of his movements. She abruptly sat back, annoyed with herself. "Why am I watching him?" she thought, looking down at her boots, because she didn't want him to catch her staring. She was a mechanic. She analyzed things. That was all. Following the brief sparring match, Darian dismissed the warrior and walked directly toward her. His breathing was completely steady, barely elevated. "You brought a wrench to a training ground," Darian noted. A faint, amused smile touched the corners of his mouth. Mara held the heavy iron tool in her lap. "It's a good wrench." "You don't need to learn how to fight yet, Mara," Darian said, stopping just a few feet away. She looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "Then what? How to stop yourself from reacting?" He held her gaze, his golden eyes intensely serious. "Your instincts are waking up. They will tell you to lash out, to strike, to shift before you are ready. You have to learn how to control the instinct, because the real danger isn't the wolves around you. It's the wild thing waking up inside you." He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she wouldn't flinch. He didn't grab her. He just placed his warm, calloused hand lightly over her knuckles, right where her fingers gripped the iron wrench. The touch sent a quiet, grounding heat up her arm. "Don't fight the pressure," Darian murmured softly, leaning in just enough for her to catch the wild pine scent of his skin. "Understand it. Control it." She looked at his hand covering hers, realizing that the most dangerous thing about the Alpha King wasn't his power, it was his patience. Directly disrupting their quiet moment, Heavy boots crunched loudly against the gravel behind them. A heavily scarred man stepped into the sunlight. He was older, his face weathered, and his eyes held a cold, judging edge. Several other warriors paused their training, turning to watch the interruption. "The human mechanic," the scarred man said. "Why is she standing in the training grounds?" Mara calmly placed her wooden mug on the bench. Darian immediately turned, his massive shoulders tensing, his voice dropping into a lethal register. "Kale." Mara reached out and grabbed Darian's forearm, stopping him instantly. She didn't want him fighting this battle for her. She stood up, brushing the dust from her jeans, and faced the scarred warrior herself. "I might not belong here," Mara said, her voice perfectly even. "But neither did your manners, apparently." A few of the younger warriors in the courtyard completely failed to hide their quiet snorts of amusement. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, more skeptical than angry. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Confidence won't make you a wolf." He lunged forward to shove her shoulder, attempting a sudden physical display of dominance to remind her of her place. Mara didn't try to summon magic. She didn't tap into a supernatural roar. Instead, her mechanic's brain took over. She saw Kale's heavy weight commit entirely to his front foot. She understood pressure. She understood leverage. She understood exactly how things broke. As Kale's hand came toward her, Mara ducked low and stepped neatly inside his guard. She didn't try to overpower him. She simply hooked her heavy boot tightly behind his planted ankle, grabbed his extended wrist, and pulled his momentum forward while pushing his knee backward. Because an engine out of alignment always tips over, gravity did the rest. Kale crashed hard into the dirt, coughing up a cloud of dry dust. Absolute silence blanketed the courtyard. Mara stood over him. She didn't gloat. She simply reached down, picked up her iron wrench from the bench, and looked at the stunned warrior on the ground. "You were right," Mara said calmly. Kale looked up, completely confused. "About what?" "Agility is a trick," Mara replied. She turned and walked away, her boots crunching steadily against the gravel. Darian stood exactly where she had left him. He didn't grin like a predator. He didn't boast to his men. He just looked at her with an unmistakable, profound pride in his golden eyes. "You didn't need me," Darian said quietly as she approached. Mara looked up at him, her grip loosening on the wrench. "I told you that." A very small, genuine smile finally broke across the Alpha King's face. "You did," Darian agreed softly. And as they walked away from the training grounds together, the heavy weight in Mara's chest began to lighten, because she was finally beginning to understand that she didn't have to change who she was to survive his world. Mara sneezed loudly as thick, gray dust plumed from the heavy leather ledger. She was buried deep inside the kingdom's oldest stone archive. The air down here smelled like dried parchment, melting beeswax candles, and forgotten secrets. She dragged her grease-stained finger down a page filled with strange, jagged symbols. She was hunting for the truth about her silver pendant, because she refused to live in the dark for one more day. Have you ever tried to fix a completely flooded engine? You can't just turn the key and hope for the best. You have to patiently drain every single drop of dirty water before it will ever run again. Mara was draining the dirty water of her past right now. Moving deeper into the heavy text, she found a drawing that made her heart completely stop. There it was. A roaring wolf head, perfectly encircled by a crescent moon. It was an exact match to her pendant, and the burning scar on her right shoulder. Beside the drawing was a name written in faded red ink, the Crescent Moon Pack. Below it was a cryptic note about an evacuation that mysteriously failed. Why didn't the pack escape? And what really happened in the western woods 19 years ago? As a direct result of her sudden gasp, a tall shadow detached itself from the doorway. Darian stepped into the flickering candlelight. He wore a simple dark shirt. His golden eyes were soft, but his massive shoulders were tense. He didn't hover. He simply walked over and stood beside her, looking down at the heavy book. "You found them," Darian murmured softly. His voice was a low, comforting rumble. In stark contrast to the violent training yard above, this hidden archive felt incredibly intimate, the wild pine scent radiating from his skin wrapped entirely around her. It was so strong, so warm. She looked up at his sharp jawline. He was right there, just inches away. "The Crescent Moon Pack," Mara whispered. She couldn't look away from his glowing eyes. Were they my family? They were a small, Fiercely loyal pack, Darian answered. He leaned in slightly. They guarded the western borders. Following that quiet realization, the heavy space between them seemed to completely vanish. Mara's breath hitched. She wanted to lean into his chest. She wanted to feel his massive arms wrap around her. She wanted him. She wanted his warmth, and she wanted the safety he offered. But a tiny cold voice in her mechanic's brain told her that something was missing. A gear wasn't turning. If they were loyal, Mara asked, her voice trembling slightly, why did my father run away with me? Because of that single sharp question, the warm air in the room suddenly turned freezing cold. Darian flinched. It was a tiny movement, but Mara saw it. The Alpha King actually flinched. He looked away from her face, staring blindly at the faded red ink on the ancient page. The beautiful, romantic tension shattered into a million sharp pieces, setting the stage for a truth she was not ready to hear. Darian slowly reached out and turned the heavy page of the ledger. The rough, dry parchment scraped loudly in the quiet room. On the next page was a formal treaty. It was signed with a royal seal. Mara leaned over the table, reading the jagged, translated words out loud. The Treaty of Ash, Mara read slowly. To prevent a kingdom-wide slaughter, the Western territories shall be withdrawn from royal protection until the conflict is resolved. Mara's blood turned to absolute ice. She traced the signature at the very bottom of the page. It wasn't signed by an old king. It was signed by a young royal heir. It was signed by Darian Vare. You abandoned them, Mara choked out. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a wooden bookshelf. Darian didn't move. I thought I was buying time. You sacrificed them, Mara yelled, her voice shaking the stone walls. Darian's jaw tightened. I know what it looks like. Don't tell me what it looks like, Mara snapped back, her chest heaving. I lived it. Have you ever accidentally snipped the wrong wire while fixing a radio? Once you cut that main power wire, the connection is completely dead. You can never uncut it. Darian had cut the wire to her entire family. I was 18, Darian said quietly. His voice was completely hollow. I thought I was choosing who would survive. I didn't understand that I was choosing who would be left behind. Because he explained his terrible mistake so openly, Mara felt her entire world collapse. He didn't want them to die. He believed the pack would retreat safely. He believed the royal commanders had secured an evacuation. But something had gone terribly wrong. She looked at the heavy silver pendant in her trembling hand. Her adoptive father hadn't just run away from a random tragedy. He had run away from a failed system. He hid Mara in the human world because he couldn't trust the crown that had left them exposed. Despite the overwhelming grief crushing her chest, Mara didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, her emotional walls slammed back up, thick and impenetrable. The man she was starting to fall deeply in love with was at the center of the decision that had torn her entire life apart. She dropped the heavy ledger onto the floor, because her hands suddenly lost all their strength. The loud thud echoed in the quiet room, forcing Mara to make the hardest decision of her entire life. The metallic clink of cold steel echoed sharply in the guest bedroom. Mara shoved her heavy wrenches back into the canvas tool roll. She tied the thick leather strap tight. Her hands were moving on pure, mechanical autopilot. Pack up. Fix it. Keep moving. How do you forgive the person who broke your world before they even knew you existed? Can love actually survive the ultimate mistake? She hoisted the heavy tool roll over her shoulder. She was leaving. Stepping out into the cool, moonlit courtyard, Mara found Darian waiting near the main wooden gates. He wasn't blocking her path. He was simply standing in the deep shadows. Because she couldn't look at his glowing eyes, Mara stared at the dirt path. Every single glance felt like a total betrayal to the father who had raised her. You are leaving, Darian stated. It wasn't a question. My entire human life, Mara started, her voice cracking painfully. My quiet garage. My isolation. The lies my father told me. All of it happened because of a choice you made. If I had known the evacuation would fail, Darian started, his voice rough. But you didn't know, Mara interrupted, gripping her canvas bag tightly. And that's the point, Darian. You made a choice. And I have to live with the consequences. I can't just pretend this didn't happen because we have some magical mate bond. She waited for him to use his alpha tone. She braced herself for him to command her to stay. She fully expected him to use his massive power to keep what belonged to him. Moving forward with heavy steps, Darian stopped just 3 feet away from her. He didn't step closer, because true love required an open door, not a locked cage. His jaw tightened. For the first time, Mara saw the immense, suffocating grief he had spent 19 years carrying, without allowing anyone else to see it. "I spent 19 years searching for you," Darian said quietly. "I will not spend the rest of my life holding you prisoner." He stepped entirely out of her way. He was letting her go. The most powerful, terrifying wolf in the world was standing aside, offering her complete and absolute freedom. Mara packed her wrenches. She packed her hammer. She packed everything she could carry, except the one thing she couldn't put into the bag: her feelings for him. She walked past the Alpha King, stepping through the ancient timber gates and into the dark woods alone. Darian didn't follow. He simply watched her leave. And somehow, that hurt more than if he had tried to stop her. As the heavy gates slowly closed behind her, Mara realized the forest was not what frightened her anymore. It was the thought that she might never see him again. The heavy steel hammer slammed violently into the dented workbench, but the deafening crack didn't even come close to drowning out the suffocating silence in her chest. Mara stood in the exact center of her freezing garage. It had been 3 days since she walked out of the Wolf Kingdoms. 3 days of scrubbing rough grit soap into her knuckles. 3 days of forcing herself to breathe. She swung the hammer again, striking the bent metal surface. Bang. She swung again. Bang. She wanted to feel the satisfying vibration of fixing something broken, but all she felt was entirely hollow. Returning to the cold concrete of her human life, Mara realized that her sanctuary didn't feel safe anymore. It just felt incredibly empty. Because the garage was completely stripped of his heavy, wild pine scent, every single shadow felt cold and lifeless. She looked at the vintage black car still sitting in her driveway. Darian hadn't sent anyone to collect it. He had simply left it there. A massive, silent reminder of the night her entire world changed. She straightened the bent metal. She swept up the shattered glass. She locked the heavy iron doors. But doing the work didn't bring her the peace it used to. She walked over to her father's old toolbox to put the hammer away. As she slid the bottom drawer shut, the metal caught on something hidden deep in the back track. Mara frowned, pulling the drawer entirely out. Tucked beneath the greasy metal tray was a half-burned piece of thick parchment. It was a letter. She carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The edges were scorched black, but she could clearly read a few hurried words written in her father's frantic handwriting. "The Shadow Wolf warned us too late. The king's orders were intercepted by..." The rest of the page was completely burned away. Who was the Shadow Wolf, and why hadn't her father told Darian the truth about the intercepted orders? Mara stared at the burned letter, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. Because her father had clearly known more about the failed evacuation than he ever admitted, the terrible story Darian believed 19 years ago was only half of the truth. She folded the scorched paper and slipped it into her pocket, the rough texture burning against her skin like a physical brand. She stared at the empty garage walls, desperately wishing she could just ask the Alpha King what it meant. But she was the one who had walked away. Repairing the physical damage to her building was easy, but repairing the gaping hole in her reality was going to require her to finally face the man she left behind. Despite the familiar, comforting smell of motor oil and old dust, sleep became entirely impossible for Mara. She lay on the small cot in the back office of the garage, staring blankly at the stained ceiling tiles. It was 2 a.m. The human city outside was supposed to be quiet, but her waking instincts were tearing her human senses completely apart. Without Darian's massive, grounding presence to anchor her, the wildness waking up inside her blood was growing restless and incredibly loud. The hum of the old refrigerator sounded like a roaring jet engine. The ticking of the wall clock felt like a heavy hammer striking a steel anvil. The distant city traffic echoed like a stampeding herd of cattle. Mara clamped her hands tightly over her ears, gritting her teeth as a searing pain shot through her jaw. Because she was fighting the terrifying pressure inside her own bones, her body was constantly vibrating with pent-up, explosive energy. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on a calming memory. She didn't picture her childhood. She didn't picture her tools. She pictured glowing golden eyes. She remembered the intense, radiating heat of Darian's hand covering hers on the training grounds. She remembered the deep, rumbling vibration of his voice when he told her to stop fighting her instincts. Understand it. Control it. Mara took a deep, shuddering breath. She dropped her hands from her ears. She stopped trying to block the noise out, and instead, she let the wildness flow over her. Instantly, the overwhelming roar of the city faded into sharp, distinct layers. She could hear the soft scurry of a field mouse in the walls. She could hear the wind rustling the dead leaves outside. And then, she caught a scent. Faint, almost impossible to detect. Wild pine. Cracked thunderstorms. Darian. Mara's eyes snapped open. He wasn't there. She knew that. The scent was just a phantom, pulled from her own deep longing. But for the very first time, she understood something incredibly important. She didn't miss him because the mate bond demanded it. She missed him because she wanted him. The human world she fought so hard to protect was no longer enough, pushing her closer to a choice she was finally ready to make. In the wake of her sleepless nights, the bright morning sun felt like a glaring spotlight when Mara finally opened the garage doors for business. She needed normalcy. She needed a routine. But the universe had absolutely no intention of letting her pretend to be a simple human mechanic today. At noon, a large, aggressive man pulled his sputtering pickup truck right into her bay. He hopped out, his face red and his demeanor incredibly hostile. He was twice her size, reeking of cheap beer and sour sweat. "You didn't fix the brakes right," the man shouted, slamming his heavy fist down hard onto her front counter. "I want my money back, little girl, or I'm taking it out of this shop." A week ago, Mara would have grabbed her iron wrench. A week ago, she would have argued back using logic and stubborn human grit. Today, she didn't even flinch. Because she had stood face to face with a monstrous, shifting werewolf, a loud human bully felt like a completely insignificant insect. Mara slowly wiped her hands on her rag. She looked up at the angry man. She didn't yell. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply let the heavy, suffocating pressure of her waking wolf rise into her eyes. "The brakes are fine," Mara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It echoed with a strange, unnatural dual tone. "You blew the transmission because you don't know how to drive. Step away from my counter." The man opened his mouth to scream again, but he froze. He stared at Mara's eyes. They weren't brown anymore. For one fleeting, terrifying second, they flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. The air pressure in the small office dropped so violently that the man actually gasped for breath. He didn't know why he was suddenly terrified. He just knew, on a deep, primal level, that he was standing in front of an apex predator. He stumbled backward, his face turning pale. He didn't say another word. He practically ran back to his broken truck and scrambled inside. Stepping away from the counter, Mara watched him leave, her heart completely steady. She looked at the burned letter again. Then she looked at the vintage black car sitting in her driveway. 3 days ago, she had walked away from Darian because she needed to know whether choosing him would mean losing herself. Now she knew the answer. She could stand on her own. She could protect herself. She could keep her garage. She could remain Mara Vale, and she could still love him. Mara folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She picked up the silver keys to the vintage car. This time, she wasn't returning to the Wolf Kingdoms because she was afraid. She wasn't returning because Darian was her mate. She was returning because she wanted to see him, and that was a choice no wolf, no king, and no mate bond could make for her. The massive, ancient timber gates of the Wolf Kingdom loomed out of the freezing darkness. Mara cut the engine of the vintage black car. She didn't wait for a guard. She didn't hesitate at the border. She grabbed her canvas tool roll, patted her pocket to ensure the burned letter was still there, and walked straight through the heavy wooden arches. In stark contrast to her agonizing departure days ago, the night air now felt incredibly crisp and clear. She navigated the dirt paths of the sleeping settlement, her boots crunching softly against the frozen gravel. She didn't have to search for him. Her waking senses pulled her directly toward the high stone ridge overlooking the central courtyard. Darian stood at the edge of the cliff. He was staring out into the vast, black ocean of the western woods. His broad shoulders were rigid, carrying the suffocating weight of 19 years of grief. Because her footsteps were entirely human, she knew he heard her approaching long before she reached the summit. He didn't turn around immediately. The muscles in his back tightened, as if he was bracing himself for a ghost. When he finally turned, his glowing golden eyes locked onto hers. He didn't rush forward. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He simply looked at her, his chest rising and falling with a heavy, ragged breath. Mara stopped 3 feet away. The space between them was electric, vibrating with everything they hadn't said. "You told me you didn't know what happened that night," Mara said quietly. Darian's jaw flexed. "I didn't." Mara reached into her pocket. She pulled out the scorched, brittle piece of parchment and held it out into the cold night air. "Then let's find out," she said. Darian looked down at the paper. He took it gently from her fingers, his rough skin brushing against hers. A sudden, violent spark of heat jumped between them, proving that the distance hadn't weakened their connection at all. He read the frantic, burned handwriting. "The Shadow Wolf warned us too late." The king's orders were intercepted by, as a direct result of reading those words, the absolute foundations of Darian's composure began to crack. His golden eyes flared, shifting from quiet sorrow to a terrifying, lethal realization. "The Shadow Wolf was my father's most trusted scout," Darian whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "He was found dead in the western woods the morning after the massacre. We thought the rival packs killed him. He wasn't killed by rival packs," Mara realized, the structural integrity of the old lie finally collapsing. "He was silenced by someone inside this camp." Following that horrifying revelation, a deep, guttural chuckle echoed from the shadows of the stone ridge. Mara spun around. A monstrously large man stepped out from behind the heavy stone pillars. It wasn't Kale. This man was significantly older, covered in thick, silver-streaked scars that mapped a lifetime of brutal violence. He was Varg, the supreme leader of the traditionalist faction, and his sheer physical mass made the air feel incredibly thin. "Secrets buried in the dirt should stay in the dirt," Varg rumbled. His yellow eyes locked onto Mara with absolute disgust. Darian stepped smoothly in front of Mara. He didn't shift, but his voice became a terrifying, inhuman vibration. "You intercepted the evacuation orders. You left the Crescent Moon Pack to die." Because the truth was finally exposed, Varg didn't even try to deny it. "They were weak," Varg spat, his heavy fists clenching. "They sympathized with humans. They diluted our sacred bloodlines. Your father was too soft to cull them, and you were too young to understand what true strength required. I simply ensured the rival packs did the kingdom a favor. Have you ever looked at a perfectly standing bridge and suddenly realized the main support pillars were entirely rotten?" Mara realized the tragedy of her childhood wasn't an accident of war. It was a calculated, hateful murder, orchestrated by the very wolves standing in this camp. "You will hang for treason," Darian commanded. The Alpha King's power slammed down over the ridge, thick and suffocating. Varg laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "You cannot execute me, boy. Not unless you break the absolute, primal law of our ancestors." Varg raised a massive, scarred finger and pointed it directly at Mara. "I invoke the right of purity. I challenge the human mechanic for her right to stand in this territory." Mara froze. "She is my mate," Darian snarled, stepping closer to Varg. "You will not touch her. If she is your queen, she must defend her own crown," Varg roared back, his voice echoing across the waking courtyard below. "If you fight for her, you forfeit your throne, and this entire kingdom burns in civil war. Let the human prove she is a wolf, or let her die like one." Darian's massive hands tightened at his sides, every muscle in his body straining against the ancient law that kept him from intervening. He was ready to tear the kingdom apart. He was ready to throw away his crown, his legacy, and his life, just to keep her safe. But Mara stepped out from behind his broad back. She didn't need him to forfeit his throne. She didn't need him to destroy his people. She needed him to let her fight. "I accept," Mara said coldly, dropping her canvas tool bag onto the stone. Despite the fear twisting through her stomach, Mara walked into the center of the stone clearing. Varg didn't waste another second. His body shifted with terrifying speed. His frame expanded, silver fur sweeping across his shoulders as he dropped onto 4 massive paws. The wolf that stood before Mara was enormous, far larger than the creature that had attacked her garage. Mara planted her boots firmly against the stone. Leverage. She had beaten Kale because she understood weight. She could do this. The silver wolf lunged. Mara moved. She slipped beneath the first swipe, twisted around his front leg, and pulled with everything she had. For one glorious second, the massive beast stumbled. Then Varg recovered. His sheer weight overwhelmed her. His heavy shoulder struck her hard enough to send her skidding backward across the stone. Mara stopped herself with both hands. Pain flashed through her body, sharp and jarring. But she forced herself upright. Varg turned toward her. His golden eyes burned with cruel satisfaction. Still standing? Mara wiped the dust from her mouth. Unfortunately for you. A few stunned murmurs rose from the gathering crowd of wolves. Varg charged again. This time, Mara couldn't move fast enough. The massive wolf knocked her backward, pinning her entirely against the cold stone of the courtyard. She struggled. Nothing worked. Her strength wasn't enough. Her leverage wasn't enough. Her instincts weren't enough. For the first time since entering the wolf kingdoms, Mara felt completely powerless. Across the clearing, Darian's entire body went rigid. His claws emerged. His golden eyes became almost entirely black. Mara. His voice carried across the courtyard. Not an order, a warning, a plea. She looked at him. He was ready to break every law in his kingdom for her. But Mara shook her head. Don't. She couldn't let him sacrifice everything for her. She closed her eyes. And then, she stopped fighting. Not because she was giving up, because she finally understood what Darian had been trying to teach her. Don't fight the pressure. Understand it. Control it. Mara took one slow breath, then another. The world became strangely quiet. She could hear every heartbeat around the clearing. She could hear the wind moving through the trees. She could hear Darian's heartbeat. And beneath all of it, something else. Something ancient. Something enormous. Something that had been waiting inside her for 24 years. The silver pendant beneath her shirt suddenly became scorching hot. The crescent scar on her shoulder began to glow, shining through the fabric of her jacket. Varg's ears flattened. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in the giant wolf's eyes. Mara opened hers. They were no longer brown. They were brilliant gold. But behind that gold was something far older than the wolves surrounding her. The air itself seemed to bend around her, vibrating with an ancient power that made every wolf in the courtyard instinctively fall silent. Varg instinctively stepped backward. Mara slowly rose to her feet. She didn't transform. She didn't grow claws. She didn't roar. She simply stood there. And every single wolf in the courtyard slowly, completely lowered their head. Darian stared at her in complete disbelief. The expression on his face wasn't fear. It was profound recognition, and something dangerously close to wonder. The shadow wolf, he whispered. Mara looked at him, the golden light in her eyes reflecting the moonlight. What am I? Darian took one slow step forward. His eyes never left hers. I don't know. For the first time since finding her, the Alpha King looked completely without answers. Then his gaze softened. But I think we've finally found out why they were so afraid of you. In the heavy, suffocating silence that followed, the massive silver wolf took a slow, hesitant step backward. Varg was terrified. The supreme leader of the traditionalists, the monster who had slaughtered her entire family, was actually trembling. He bared his jagged teeth, a low snarl rumbling in his massive chest, but he didn't attack. Glowing eyes do not make a true wolf. Varg roared, his heavy voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. The rite of purity demands blood. A trick of the light will not save you tomorrow, when the sun reaches its peak. Because he was a coward hiding behind ancient laws, Varg turned his massive silver body and melted into the deep shadows of the tree line. He was running to gather his loyalists. He was retreating to plan his final strike. The tense courtyard slowly began to empty. The gathered warriors kept their heads bowed, quickly fading back into the dark timber longhouses. They were deeply unnerved. They had expected to see a fragile human broken on the stones. Instead, they had witnessed the awakening of a legend. Once the gravel path was entirely clear, the Alpha King finally moved. Darian didn't shout victorious commands. He didn't parade her around like a prized trophy. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, desperate strides. His golden eyes were wide, scanning her face, her shoulders, her hands. He stopped just inches away from her. Are you all right? Darian breathed out. His voice wasn't royal. It wasn't intimidating. It was raw, breathless, and incredibly vulnerable. Mara looked up at him. She expected him to demand answers about her power. She expected him to ask about the glowing gold in her eyes. But the very first thing he cared about was her safety. "I'm okay," Mara whispered. Darian closed his eyes. A heavy, shuddering breath escaped his chest. He reached out slowly, his large, warm hands gently cupping her face. His thumbs softly traced the high arches of her cheekbones. "I thought I was going to lose you again," he murmured. The intense heat radiating from his palms sent a violent shiver straight down her spine. The terrible fear of the courtyard melted away, completely replaced by a sizzling, magnetic pull. Because she finally trusted him entirely, Mara leaned her face into his rough hands. "You didn't," she said softly. "But if Varg wants a wolf tomorrow, I have to figure out how to give him one." Darian opened his glowing eyes, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "Then we will find her together," Darian promised, turning to lead her into the safety of his private chambers. Despite the roaring fire in the massive stone hearth, Mara still felt a strange, icy thrill shivering deep inside her bones. She sat on the edge of a heavy, fur-lined bed inside Darian's private quarters. The room smelled incredibly safe. It smelled like wild pine, old parchment, and burning cedar. Darian stood by the wooden table, poring over the burned letter and an ancient leather-bound history book he had pulled from the deepest part of the archives. "How do you embrace a legacy when you've spent your whole life fixing machines?" "The Shadow Wolf wasn't just a title," Darian murmured, his finger tracing a faded drawing of a crescent moon. "It was a bloodline thought to be a complete myth. Protectors born once every few generations." Mara stared at the flickering firelight. What could they do? Darian looked up, his golden eyes filled with a rare, quiet uncertainty. "I don't fully know. The texts are incomplete. They describe a wolf that doesn't fight the earth, but moves through it. A predator that even an alpha king cannot command. It is something entirely different from my kind." Following that mysterious realization, the final puzzle piece locked firmly into place. Her father hadn't just hidden her because of a war. He had hidden her because she was the ultimate threat to the traditionalists. "That's why Varg killed my pack," Mara said softly, her hands gripping the thick fur blanket. "He wanted absolute control. But he couldn't control my bloodline, so he orchestrated the massacre to wipe us out." Darian walked over and knelt directly in front of her. He was a towering, powerful king, but he completely lowered himself to meet her eyes. "I can challenge him," Darian offered, his golden eyes burning with fierce protectiveness. "I can strip him of his rank and kill him myself." "If you do that, his loyalists will start a civil war," Mara answered, her mechanic's logic seeing the clear structural flaw in that plan. "You'd tear your own kingdom apart for me. I would burn this entire world down to keep you safe," Darian growled. A low, incredibly passionate sound that made her heart pound violently. "I know you would," Mara whispered. She reached out, her fingers tangling gently into his dark, thick hair. "But you don't have to, because I'm not hiding anymore." In stark contrast to the cold stone of the courtyard, the heat building inside Mara's chest was absolutely blistering. It was an hour before dawn. They stood in a secluded, moonlit clearing just behind the king's chambers. There were no spectators, no judging eyes. It was just Mara, the ancient forest, and the man she loved. Have you ever tried to unseize a completely rusted engine? You can't force the gears. You have to apply heat, add oil, and let the metal naturally expand until the blockage finally breaks free. Her wolf was the exact same way. "Don't fight the pressure," Darian murmured. He stood entirely bare-chested in the freezing snow, his massive body radiating an impossible warmth. "Understand it. Control it. Let it break you, Mara, and then let it rebuild you." Mara closed her eyes. She stopped holding on to her human logic. She stopped trying to be the quiet mechanic from the garage. Because she felt completely safe with Darian watching over her, she finally let the invisible cage around her heart shatter. The crescent scar on her shoulder erupted in agonizing, white-hot fire. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her spine violently arched. The sound of cracking bone echoed in the quiet clearing, but it didn't feel like dying. It felt like breaking out of a suffocating prison. Her fingernails elongated, digging deep into the frozen earth as dark fur exploded across her skin. But as the transformation completed, she realized her senses weren't just heightened. They were fundamentally different. She opened her eyes. She stood up. She wasn't massive like Darian. She wasn't a hulking brute like Varg. Her fur was a deep, shimmering midnight black, heavily dusted with striking silver, but her body felt incredibly weightless. The shadows of the tree line didn't just hide her. They seemed to actively cling to her fur, bending the moonlight around her sleek, aerodynamic frame. Darian slowly walked toward her. His eyes were wide with pure, staggering wonder. He had seen thousands of wolves shift. He had commanded the greatest warriors in the realm. But as he looked at Mara, he stopped dead in his tracks. "I have never seen anything like you," Darian whispered, completely awestruck by the impossible silence of her movements. She didn't feel like a regular wolf. She felt like a finely tuned, perfectly balanced machine that had finally been given the spark of life. As the first golden rays of the morning sun began to pierce the dark tree line, Mara turned her sleek, silver-dusted head toward the central courtyard. The final hour had arrived. She was ready to face Varg. And this time, she wasn't going to fight Varg like a wolf. She was going to show him what the shadow wolf truly was. Directly following the quiet peace of the sunrise, the blinding midday sun baked the heavy stone courtyard, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the gathered pack. Mara walked slowly into the center of the clearing. The entire kingdom had turned out to watch the rite of purity. The air was incredibly thick. It smelled of dry dust, anxious sweat, and raw anticipation. Across the stone circle, Varg was already waiting in his gargantuan silver wolf form. He was pacing aggressively, his massive jaws snapping at the empty air, fully expecting to crush the fragile human mechanic who had defied him the night before. How does a lone mechanic dismantle a towering, unstoppable machine? Moving forward with complete, chilling calm, Mara didn't break her stride. She didn't drop to her knees in agonizing pain to shift. Because she had finally stopped fighting her own ancient blood, the transformation didn't break her. It simply released her. As she took her final step, her human form blurred. It was completely silent. 1 second she was a woman in denim and leather, and the very next second, she was a sprawling, midnight black wolf, heavily dusted with striking silver. A collective, stunned gasp echoed around the courtyard. She wasn't as large as Varg, but as she moved, the pack finally understood what the shadow wolf truly was. Her paws made absolutely no sound against the loose gravel. Her dark fur seemed to literally absorb the harsh sunlight, making her outline shift and warp like dark water. Varg lunged forward with a deafening, thunderous roar. He expected her to meet his charge. He expected a brutal collision of bone and muscle. But Mara wasn't going to fight him like a traditional wolf. She was going to fight him like a mechanic. She didn't rely on brute force. She didn't rely on blind rage. She didn't rely on heavy mass. Instead, she watched his massive front paws leave the ground. Because an engine running at maximum torque cannot suddenly reverse its momentum, Varg was completely locked into his heavy, predictable trajectory. Mara simply slipped beneath his massive jaws. She moved with blinding, impossible speed. She hooked her thick front leg behind his planted back ankle and rammed her shoulder directly into his exposed knee joint. Varg's massive weight betrayed him entirely. He crashed into the heavy stone ground so hard the impact shook the dry dust from the surrounding timber longhouses. Before the silver beast could even attempt to scramble back to his feet, Mara was already there. She pinned his heavy throat to the ground. She didn't bite down. She didn't tear his flesh to claim a bloody, violent victory. She simply applied exactly enough crushing downward pressure to completely cut off his air supply. Varg thrashed wildly, but her balance was absolutely perfect. Because he was finally suffocating under the weight of his own terrible mistakes, the giant traditionalist let out a high, pathetic whine. His massive body went completely limp in total, undeniable submission, ending the bloody reign of the old ways forever. In the wake of Varg's staggering defeat, a stunned, absolute silence fell over the wolf kingdom. Mara stepped back from the defeated leader. She shook her dark fur, the silver dust catching the bright midday sun. With a fluid, completely silent motion, she shifted back into her human form. She stood in the center of the courtyard, her bare feet planted firmly against the warm, rough stone. She didn't demand a royal crown. She didn't demand their absolute submission. She didn't demand their terrible fear. But one by one, every single warrior in the traditionalist faction lowered their eyes and bowed their heads to the human mechanic who had just outthought their greatest fighter. The crowd slowly parted. Darian walked into the center of the ring. He wasn't moving like a terrifying alpha king right now. He was moving like a man who had just watched a miracle unfold in front of his eyes. His golden eyes were completely wide. He stopped 2 feet away from her, the intense heat of his massive body washing over her freezing skin. "You did it," Darian breathed out, his voice thick with raw, unchecked emotion. Mara looked up at him. The physical fight was over, but the hardest part of her emotional journey was just beginning. "I know the truth now," Mara said softly, her voice carrying only to his ears. "I know that your decision 19 years ago wasn't made out of malice. I know you thought you were saving lives." Darian didn't defend himself. He didn't offer hollow excuses. He just stood there and completely absorbed the lingering pain in her eyes. "But that choice still cost me my family, Darian," she whispered, a single tear cutting a clean line through the dust on her cheek. "It cost me my pack. It forced my father to lie to me for 24 years. Because he finally understood the true weight of her lifelong loss, the Alpha King slowly bowed his head. I know, and I will carry that guilt until my very last breath." Mara looked at the incredibly powerful man standing in front of her. She looked at the man who had possessed every reason to keep her beside him, and had still opened the gates when she chose to leave. She realized something profound. Darian was not the scared 18-year-old boy who had signed that terrible treaty. He was the man who had given her a genuine choice, even when it broke his own heart. "I don't forgive you yet," Mara said quietly. Darian's expression didn't change. "I know." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "But I'm not walking away anymore." His glowing eyes softened, shining with a quiet, desperate hope. "That's enough." "It isn't forgiveness," she reminded him gently. "Then I'll earn that," Darian vowed, his voice a deep, unshakable rumble. Mara finally reached out. She took his large, calloused hand, her small, grease-stained fingers lacing tightly with his. The surrounding wolves didn't erupt into a deafening howl. They simply watched in quiet, profound respect as the Alpha King and the Shadow Wolf stood together, finally building a bridge over a 19-year-old wound. Stepping back into the familiar smell of motor oil and rusted metal, Mara wiped a thick smudge of black grease from her cheek. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the human city. The garage doors were wide open, letting the warm autumn breeze sweep freely through the bay. She had replaced the shattered glass jars. She had pounded the deep dents out of her workbench. Her sanctuary was completely whole again, and so was she. Heavy, familiar boots crunched softly against the concrete floor. Mara turned around, a genuine, radiant smile instantly lighting up her face. Darian stood just inside the garage doors. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit today, looking every inch the powerful Alpha King preparing to handle the complicated politics of his hidden realm. He walked over to her workbench, his golden eyes soft and intensely fond. "The border treaties are finalized," Darian said, his deep voice vibrating pleasantly in her chest. "Varg's loyalists have completely surrendered their lands. The kingdom is quiet. For now," Mara teased, tossing her heavy iron wrench onto the bench. She stepped directly into his space. She didn't care that her denim overalls were covered in dirt. She wrapped her arms securely around his waist, resting her head against his solid chest. Darian immediately rested his chin on the top of her head, completely pulling her into his massive, comforting warmth. They had built a beautiful, impossible life, perfectly balanced between two entirely different worlds. Because duty always called him back to the sprawling forest, Darian eventually stepped back, picking up the silver keys to his repaired vintage car. "I have to meet with the Northern Elders," Darian murmured, his thumb gently brushing her lower lip. Mara leaned casually against the frame of the garage door as he slid into the driver's seat. She watched him start the heavy engine, the familiar mechanical roar filling the quiet street. She crossed her arms over her chest and quietly asked, "When will you be back?" Darian looked at her through the open window. Mara immediately regretted asking, feeling that tiny, stubborn flash of her old human independence playfully pushing back against the mate bond. But the faint, breathtaking smile appearing on the Alpha King's face told her he had understood exactly what she meant. "Before the moon rises, little mechanic," he rumbled. He shifted the car into drive, pulling slowly out of the driveway. Mara watched the vintage car disappear down the street. Then she looked at the wrench resting on her workbench. Human mechanic. Shadow wolf. She no longer needed to choose between them. She was both. And for the first time in her life, Mara Vale belonged exactly where she had chosen to be.